If I'm in the mood for a serious conversation, you'll see it in my face. If I'm in the mood to relax and have fun, read that and don't try to get into deep conversations with me in those moments.
Edward and Marissa finally over. She demands $500K, but Edward says no. Edward thought the hardest part of ending his relationship with Marissa would be actually telling her that he was done. But he was completely wrong. Because the moment Marissa realized he was not threatening another temporary breakup and was genuinely preparing to leave, the conversation took a turn even Edward did not see coming. Instead of asking him to stay, instead of promising that things could change, and instead of trying to restart the same emotional cycle they had been trapped inside for months, Marissa looked directly at him and made one demand that instantly changed the entire mood of the room. She wanted $500,000 before Edward walked away, and judging by Edward's reaction, she might as well have asked him for $5 million. He stared at her like he was waiting for the punchline, but Marissa was completely serious, and when she began explaining why she believed she deserved that money, Edward's response was immediate, cold, and absolutely final, because he simply told her no. What makes this situation even crazier is that the argument did not begin with money at all. Because just a few hours earlier, Edward and Marissa were fighting about something they had fought about countless times before, which was whether Edward was actually doing enough to build the kind of future Marissa wanted. Marissa believed she had spent months adjusting her plans, carrying responsibilities, making space for Edward, and defending a relationship that repeatedly created stress in her life, while Edward believed he had spent the exact same months trying to prove that he was worthy of a place that never truly felt secure. That difference matters, because they were no longer arguing over one decision or one mistake. They were arguing over two completely different versions of the relationship. And both of them believed their version was the one nobody else was taking seriously. The strange part was that Edward was not raising his voice this time, and that silence immediately made Marissa nervous. Normally, when things became tense between them, Edward would keep pushing for an answer, because uncertainty bothered him more than almost anything else. And if Marissa became distant, Edward would usually want to know whether she was angry, whether she still wanted the relationship, and whether one disagreement had suddenly changed everything. This time was completely different, because when Marissa criticized another decision he had made, Edward listened without interrupting her and then quietly asked a question that caught her completely off guard. He wanted to know whether there was realistically anything he could do that would make her feel permanently secure about marrying him, or whether every new problem would always bring them back to the same conversation about whether they belonged together. Marissa started explaining that relationships require accountability, maturity, and realistic planning. But Edward stopped her, because those were not the words he needed to hear. He was asking whether she actually trusted the relationship, and Marissa's hesitation gave him an answer she never verbally said. That tiny pause became the moment everything shifted, because Edward looked at Marissa and told her that he could not continue building a future where he constantly felt like one bad week could erase every good month that came before it. Marissa immediately pushed back and told him that he was exaggerating, because according to her, she had every right to question decisions that affected both of their lives, but Edward said questioning decisions was not the problem. The problem was that he felt like every argument eventually became a judgment about him as a person, and every mistake became another reason for Marissa to wonder whether committing to him had been the wrong decision. Marissa clearly did not like hearing that, because from her perspective, she was the person taking the larger emotional and financial risk. But Edward had reached a point where he no longer cared who technically had more to lose. He was tired of feeling like the relationship belonged to Marissa, and he was simply waiting for permission to remain inside it. Then, Edward said the words Marissa clearly did not expect him to say, because he told her he wanted to end the relationship permanently, and for several seconds she almost looked confused rather than heartbroken. She asked whether he was seriously ending everything because of one argument, but Edward told her this was exactly the problem, because she still believed they were talking about one argument while he was thinking about dozens of moments that had slowly changed the way he felt. Marissa reminded him that couples fight, people get scared, families disagree, and nobody enters marriage without questions. But Edward said he understood all of that. What he no longer understood was why their disagreements kept making him feel like he had to audition for his own relationship. Marissa accused him of turning normal concerns into personal attacks, while Edward argued that she had spent so long asking whether he was prepared to be her husband that she never noticed he had started asking whether he even wanted the job anymore. That comment hit Marissa differently, because up until this moment, she still appeared convinced Edward would eventually calm down and take everything back. Their relationship had survived emotional confrontations before, and there had always been some conversation afterward where both sides softened, explained themselves, and found enough hope to keep going. Marissa seemed to be waiting for that familiar moment, but Edward was not giving it to her. She told him they should stop talking for the night and revisit everything the following morning, because decisions made during emotional arguments usually create regret. But Edward told her he was not making the decision because he was angry. He said the reason he sounded so calm was because he had already been thinking about leaving long before that night, and suddenly Marissa's expression changed completely. Anger she knew how to fight, disappointment she knew how to explain, but Edward emotionally checking out before she even realized it was happening was something she had not prepared for. Marissa asked how long he had been thinking this way, and Edward admitted that the idea started becoming real every time they survived another major fight, only to return to exactly the same uncertainty later. He said there was a point where reconciliation stopped feeling reassuring, because he had begun expecting the next crisis almost immediately afterward. Even when things were good, part of him was waiting for another conversation about money, family, responsibility, commitment, or whether Marissa had moved too quickly. Marissa told him that those conversations were necessary because marriage was serious, but Edward agreed and said that was exactly why he was leaving. If they were this exhausted before they even reached the stable future they kept talking about, then marriage was not going to magically repair everything they had avoided solving. That answer seemed to frustrate Marissa because Edward was using the same serious, practical language she had often used with him, except now he was using it to justify walking away. Then Marissa made a comment that changed the entire direction of the conversation, because she told Edward that if he was really going to leave, then they needed to discuss what he owed her before he disappeared from her life. Edward initially thought she meant a few shared expenses or something connected to plans they had already made. So he told her they could go through anything legitimate and make sure nobody was left carrying a bill that belonged to both of them. Marissa quickly made it clear she was talking about something much bigger than that. She told him she had calculated the financial impact the relationship had created on her life, including the decisions she had made based on the assumption that they were building a permanent future together. And when Edward asked what number she had in mind, Marissa said $500,000. Edward did not even respond immediately, because for a moment, he seemed genuinely unsure whether he had heard her correctly. Edward finally repeated the number back to her, almost like he needed Marissa to hear how extreme it sounded once somebody else said it out loud. But Marissa did not change her expression. She explained that she was not simply talking about one wedding bill or a handful of shared expenses, because, according to her, the relationship had affected major decisions involving her household, long-term planning, travel, legal preparation, time, family arrangements, and opportunities she had either delayed or reorganized because Edward was supposed to become part of her permanent future. Edward listened for a while, but the longer Marissa talked, the more irritated he became, because everything she listed sounded to him like the normal risk two adults accept when they choose to build a relationship together. Marissa disagreed completely because she believed the consequences had not been equal, and she was not willing to watch Edward walk away feeling free while she remained responsible for everything that had been changed around him. Edward asked Marissa whether she genuinely believed a failed relationship automatically entitled one person to $500,000 from the other, and Marissa told him he was deliberately simplifying what she was saying. She insisted that she had invested heavily in a future Edward had repeatedly promised he wanted, and she believed he was now leaving after benefiting from her support, her stability, and the structure she had provided. Edward's face changed the second she used the word benefiting, because that touched the insecurity underneath almost every financial argument they had ever experienced. Edward told her that he had spent months feeling like people around Marissa already viewed him as the person who had more to gain. And now she was ending their relationship by presenting him with a price tag that somehow turned everything they had shared into a financial debt. Marissa said that was unfair, but Edward told her what felt unfair was being told that love had suddenly become an invoice. This was also the moment the earlier prenup conversations came rushing back into the argument. Because Edward reminded Marissa that he had already been willing to accept boundaries designed to protect what she had built before him. He told her he understood why financial security mattered, especially when family and children were involved, which was exactly why he had not wanted money to become proof of whether their relationship was genuine. Marissa argued that a prenup and a breakup settlement were two completely different issues, because one protected assets while the other addressed consequences created during the relationship. Edward immediately asked her where that logic ended. Because if every sacrifice could be assigned a dollar amount after a breakup, then he could make his own list too. He had changed plans, taken emotional risks, reorganized his own future, dealt with criticism, and stayed through moments where he felt unwanted. But he was not sitting across from Marissa demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars as compensation for being disappointed. Marissa told Edward there was one major difference he was refusing to acknowledge. Because she believed he always described himself as the person who had sacrificed the most simply because his sacrifices were easier to see. Edward could point to moving, adjusting, or leaving parts of his previous life behind, while Marissa's sacrifices were less dramatic but constant. She said she had made space in a life that was already established. Absorbed uncertainty she never expected to deal with, defended Edward when people close to her questioned his motives, and changed plans involving people other than herself because she trusted his promises. For the first time since the money demand appeared, Edward stopped arguing and actually listened, because this was the strongest point Marissa had made all night. He admitted that he knew she had sacrificed things too, but he still refused to accept that those sacrifices created a $500,000 obligation once the relationship ended. Marissa then asked Edward a question that made the argument far more personal, because she wanted to know whether he had ever truly intended to stay once the relationship stopped feeling exciting and started requiring uncomfortable responsibility. Edward almost laughed at that accusation, because from his perspective, he had stayed far longer than somebody avoiding difficulty would ever stay. He reminded her of the arguments he had worked through, the doubts he had tried to answer, and the number of times he had swallowed his pride because he believed one more conversation might finally create stability. Edward told Marissa he did not leave when things became difficult, because difficulty was practically the defining feature of their relationship by that point. What finally pushed him away was realizing that every time he thought they had solved the deeper issue, the same fear returned wearing a different outfit. One week it was money, another week it was trust, another week it was family, and eventually, Edward stopped believing the subject of the argument was the real problem. According to Edward, the real problem was that he never felt permanently accepted, and that was something Marissa found difficult to hear, because she believed accepting someone did not mean refusing to challenge them. Edward agreed, but he told her there was a difference between being challenged by a partner and constantly feeling assessed by one. He said he could handle Marissa telling him he had made a mistake, but he could not handle every mistake becoming evidence in an imaginary case about whether he deserved the relationship. Marissa told him nobody had ever said he did not deserve her, but Edward said nobody needed to use those exact words when the dynamic communicated the message repeatedly. Every conversation about what Marissa had built, what she had to protect, and what Edward needed to prove had slowly created a hierarchy between them, and the $500,000 demand felt like the final confirmation that even their breakup was going to be measured according to what Marissa believed she had invested in him. That accusation angered Marissa again, because she said Edward was rewriting the entire relationship in a way that conveniently made him the victim. She reminded him that she had also experienced insecurity, uncertainty, and disappointment, and there were moments where she questioned the relationship because Edward's choices gave her legitimate reasons to worry. Edward did not deny that, which made the conversation far more interesting than a simple fight over who was right. He admitted that Marissa had valid concerns at different points, but he said being valid did not automatically make the way they handled those concerns healthy. Marissa responded that Edward wanted unconditional reassurance without always giving her the consistency required to create it, while Edward believed Marissa wanted perfect consistency before she would offer unconditional partnership. Neither one could satisfy the condition the other person needed first, and suddenly, the money argument began looking like just another version of the same impossible cycle. Marissa eventually asked Edward what he thought would be fair if $500,000 was completely unacceptable, and Edward's answer surprised her, because he did not say zero. He told her that any legitimate shared obligation could be discussed openly, because if there were documented expenses they had agreed to split, outstanding commitments they had jointly created, or practical costs directly connected to decisions they made together, then he had no problem reviewing them. What he would not do was agree to a massive emotional settlement based on the idea that one person deserved compensation because the relationship failed. Marissa asked whether he expected her to absorb every consequence, while he simply packed a bag and walked away. But Edward said she was acting like he had no consequences because his were not listed on a spreadsheet. He was also losing a future he once believed in, and no amount of money would return the time either of them had spent trying to make something work that now appeared completely exhausted. That answer softened Marissa for the first time, because the conversation stopped sounding like a negotiation and started sounding like two people finally admitting they were grieving the same relationship from completely different positions. Marissa looked at Edward and asked whether he had stopped loving her, and that question was much harder for him than anything involving money. Edward did not immediately answer, which gave Marissa a moment of hope. But when he finally spoke, he explained that loving somebody and believing you should remain together were not always the same thing. He said part of him would probably care about her for a very long time, but caring was no longer enough to convince him that the relationship was good for either of them. Marissa asked how he could say that after everything they had planned, and Edward told her the plans were exactly what made leaving so painful, because nobody walks away from a future they never imagined in the first place. Marissa then offered something Edward had probably wanted to hear months earlier, because she told him they could stop making every disagreement about whether the relationship should survive. She admitted that she had sometimes allowed fear to control the way she communicated, and she acknowledged that repeatedly questioning the future could have made Edward feel disposable, even when that was not her intention. For a moment, Edward looked genuinely affected, because this was the kind of recognition he had been asking for throughout much of their relationship. The problem was timing, because words that might have repaired something earlier were arriving after Edward had already emotionally prepared himself to leave. He told Marissa he appreciated hearing it, but she immediately realized appreciation was not the response she wanted. She wanted him to change his mind, and instead, he was listening like somebody receiving closure. Marissa became emotional and told Edward they should forget the $500,000 conversation completely if that was what it took to stop everything from ending that night. This was the first moment where the huge financial demand appeared to become negotiable, which naturally raised an uncomfortable question about how much of it had been a genuine expectation and how much had been a reaction to suddenly losing control of the breakup. Edward noticed the shift too, because he asked why the money had seemed absolutely necessary 20 minutes earlier, but could suddenly disappear if he agreed to stay. Marissa said the money was never more important than the relationship, but Edward told her that was exactly why introducing it during their breakup had disturbed him so much. He felt like the moment he finally made a decision Marissa could not control, the conversation immediately became about what leaving would cost him. Marissa strongly rejected that interpretation and told Edward she was not trying to punish him for leaving, because she had spent too long protecting herself from situations where emotion caused her to ignore practical consequences. She said people love telling someone to follow their heart until that decision affects children, finances, housing, long-term plans, and responsibilities that remain after romance disappears. Edward agreed that practical consequences mattered, but he believed Marissa was now using practicality to avoid confronting something much simpler, which was that she did not expect him to be the person ending things. That comment landed because Marissa had spent so much time questioning whether Edward could meet her expectations that she apparently never considered he might eventually decide the relationship could not meet his. The balance had changed, and Marissa was suddenly experiencing the uncertainty Edward had been living with for months. Then the family issue returned, because Marissa reminded Edward how many uncomfortable conversations she had endured with people close to her who doubted whether the relationship was a smart decision. She said she had defended him even when those conversations damaged relationships around her, and now she felt foolish because the same man she had defended was preparing to leave. Edward told her he never asked to become a source of conflict between her and her family, and that was part of what exhausted him. He did not want Marissa choosing him against everybody else, because he wanted a relationship strong enough that every outside opinion did not become another courtroom where he had to defend his motives. Whenever someone questioned whether he wanted security, money, opportunity, or an easier life, Edward felt like Marissa brought part of that suspicion back into the relationship with her, even if she never meant to. Marissa said Edward was being unfair because people around her were naturally protective, especially when major life decisions were involved, and Edward said he understood protection perfectly well. What he struggled with was the point where protection became permanent suspicion. He told Marissa there were moments when he felt less like her partner and more like an applicant trying to pass another interview, because every disagreement seemed to reopen questions he believed had already been answered. Marissa said Edward only felt that way because he wanted everybody to trust him immediately, but Edward argued that immediate trust was not what he wanted at all. He wanted trust that could actually grow after time, effort, and consistency, and instead he felt like each new problem reset him back to zero. The $500,000 demand was now becoming symbolic for Edward, because it represented the same feeling that he was still being evaluated according to what he brought, what he took, and what he supposedly owed. At that point, Marissa asked the question viewers would probably be asking too, because if Edward had felt this unhappy for so long, why did he continue making plans and reassuring her that he wanted the future they had discussed? Edward admitted that he kept hoping stability would arrive after the next milestone. He believed if they solved the prenup conversation, things would calm down. Then he believed if they handled the family concerns, things would calm down. And after that, he believed time itself would prove that he was serious. Instead, every milestone created temporary relief before another issue exposed the same unresolved tension underneath. Edward said he eventually realized he was not building security, he was chasing it. And chasing something inside your own relationship eventually becomes exhausting. Marissa looked hurt hearing that, because from her perspective, she had been chasing security too. Except she had been doing it by asking harder questions, while Edward had been doing it by demanding stronger reassurance. That realization briefly created the closest thing they had reached to understanding each other all night, because they were finally describing the same problem from opposite directions. Marissa became more cautious whenever she felt uncertain, while Edward became more demanding for reassurance whenever Marissa became cautious. The more Edward pushed for certainty, the more Marissa felt pressure, and the more Marissa pulled back, the more Edward believed she was preparing to leave him. They had spent months responding to each other's fear in ways that created even more of the exact fear they were trying to avoid. The relationship was not collapsing because only one person cared, or only one person made mistakes. Because both of them had developed habits that kept turning insecurity into conflict. The difference now was that Edward appeared ready to stop participating in the cycle, even if stopping meant losing Marissa completely. Marissa asked whether Edward had told anyone he was planning to leave before telling her, because the idea that other people might have known first clearly bothered her. Edward said he had discussed his frustration generally, but insisted that the final decision was his, and Marissa immediately wondered whether people around him had encouraged the breakup. Edward almost smiled because he pointed out how ironic that accusation sounded after all the times outside opinions had affected their relationship from Marissa's side. She told him it was not the same, but Edward said that was exactly what each of them always believed whenever the situation benefited their own perspective. Advice felt reasonable when it supported your fear, and intrusive when it supported the other person's, which was another reason they had never managed to agree on where healthy concern ended and interference began. The argument returned to money one final time when Marissa asked Edward whether he would at least consider a structured settlement instead of rejecting the entire idea immediately. She said the $500,000 figure represented what she believed the relationship had cost her, but she was willing to discuss the number if Edward was prepared to acknowledge that leaving created practical consequences. Edward said he had already acknowledged that, but he refused to acknowledge a debt that existed only because Marissa had calculated emotional disappointment as financial damage. He told her they could sit with professionals, separate legitimate shared expenses from personal choices, honor any agreements already made, and leave with clear responsibilities. But he was not writing a massive check simply to purchase permission to end the relationship. Marissa disliked the phrase permission to leave, but Edward said that was exactly how the demand made him feel. Marissa asked whether he really believed she would try to trap him with money, and Edward said he did not know what she intended anymore, which was possibly the most painful answer he could have given. He explained that months earlier he would have defended her intentions immediately. But after everything that had happened, he no longer trusted himself to keep explaining away situations that made him uncomfortable. Marissa accused him of becoming cold, and Edward told her coldness was not what she was seeing. He said she was seeing someone who had finally stopped reacting to every emotional change in the room. If Marissa became upset before, Edward would panic and immediately start repairing, explaining, apologizing, or reassuring, even when he was not sure he had done anything wrong. Now, he was allowing Marissa to be upset without treating her emotions as proof that his decision must be wrong. That was when Marissa's anger finally disappeared, because she seemed to realize Edward was no longer waiting for permission, approval, or reassurance. She asked him very quietly whether this was really the end, and Edward said yes, without adding a dramatic speech afterward. Marissa asked if there was somebody else, because she needed an explanation that felt more concrete than months of accumulated emotional exhaustion, but Edward told her there was nobody else. She asked whether he had met someone, been speaking to someone, or imagined another relationship, and Edward denied all of it. He told her this decision was not about running toward another person, because it was about finally accepting that staying with Marissa was no longer bringing out a version of himself he liked. That answer made the breakup harder rather than easier, because Marissa could not blame another woman, one scandal, or one obvious betrayal for what was happening. Marissa then said something unexpectedly vulnerable. Because she admitted that part of the reason she kept questioning Edward was not necessarily because she believed he would fail, but because she was terrified of being wrong about him after defending the relationship so strongly. The more she invested, the more frightening uncertainty became, and instead of relaxing as the relationship progressed, she sometimes became even more alert to anything that looked like a warning sign. Edward understood what she was saying, but he pointed out the painful contradiction in it. The more Marissa feared losing what she had invested, the more closely she examined Edward, and the more closely she examined him, the more he felt distrusted. Eventually, her attempt to protect the relationship from a future betrayal helped create the distance she was afraid of. Marissa did not disagree this time, and the silence between them felt completely different from the silence at the beginning. Edward admitted something too, because he said his need for constant reassurance had probably made Marissa feel like she could never express concern without creating a crisis. He knew there had been moments where she wanted to discuss one practical issue, and he immediately turned it into a larger question about whether she still wanted him. That pattern forced Marissa to either reassure him before discussing her concern or risk Edward interpreting her criticism as rejection. Edward said he could see why that became exhausting, but understanding his part in the problem did not change his decision. Marissa asked why self-awareness had to arrive at the exact moment they were giving up. And Edward told her that sometimes people understand a relationship most clearly only when they stop trying desperately to save it. That was not comforting, but it was probably the most truthful moment they had shared all night. Marissa looked toward the papers connected to the financial demand and told Edward she hated that the conversation had become about money, which immediately made Edward point out that she was the person who introduced the number. Marissa said she knew that, but she had reacted from fear because suddenly she imagined every plan disappearing at once. Edward asked whether she still expected the $500,000, and Marissa did not answer immediately. She eventually said she expected fairness, which Edward noticed was very different language from what she had used earlier. He told her fairness was something he could discuss, but fear was not going to determine a settlement. If they were truly finished, then he wanted the ending to be cleaner than the relationship had been. Because continuing their emotional battle through money would only create a new version of the same cycle. Marissa asked what clean actually meant to him, and Edward explained that both of them needed to separate what they could prove from what they simply felt. Shared expenses could be documented. Property questions could be handled properly. Promises with actual financial consequences could be reviewed, and anything belonging individually to one person should remain with that person unless an agreement said otherwise. What Edward refused to do was calculate emotional pain like a business loss, because if they started doing that, neither person would ever agree on a final number. Marissa could say she deserved compensation for opening her life to him, while Edward could say he deserved compensation for moving toward a future that repeatedly made him feel insecure, and they would spend years arguing over whose disappointment was worth more. Edward told her he wanted to lose the relationship once, not keep losing it through another battle every month afterward. There was another long silence before Marissa asked the question that finally stripped everything down to the actual breakup. She wanted to know whether Edward would still be leaving if she had never mentioned money at all. That was important because part of Marissa clearly hoped the $500,000 demand had simply pushed Edward over the edge, which would mean removing the demand might remove the reason he was leaving. Edward thought about it before answering, and that hesitation briefly gave Marissa hope again. But his response closed the door. He said yes, because the money had shocked him, upset him, and confirmed certain fears he already carried. But it had not created those fears. He had reached the decision before she ever mentioned a number, and pretending otherwise would only give both of them a convenient villain instead of forcing them to confront what had actually happened between them. Marissa asked whether he regretted the relationship, and Edward said no, which seemed to surprise her after everything he had just said. He explained that something can end badly without making every part of it meaningless, because there had been real affection, real plans, real hope, and moments where he genuinely believed they were building something permanent. Marissa told him that made leaving even harder to understand, but Edward said it was precisely why he had stayed as long as he did. If the relationship had always been terrible, there would have been nothing to fight for. But the good moments repeatedly convinced both of them that the difficult pattern could eventually disappear. Instead, the good moments became resets rather than solutions, and every reconciliation gave them enough energy to repeat the same problem without actually repairing the structure underneath it. Marissa finally told Edward that she did not want to beg someone to stay who had already decided to leave, but her voice made it obvious, accepting that reality was going to be much harder than saying it. Edward told her he did not want her begging either, because one of the reasons he wanted to end things was that they had spent too much time trying to convince each other to feel safe. He said there should come a point where a relationship feels like a partnership instead of a negotiation, and they had never managed to stay at that point for very long. Marissa looked at him and said she still believed they could have reached it, while Edward admitted that possibility might always bother him. The difference was that he no longer believed possibility was enough reason to continue sacrificing their peace. Then, Marissa picked up the financial papers again, looked at them for several seconds, and placed them back down without pushing them toward Edward. She told him they would need to speak about practical matters later, and Edward agreed, But he made one final boundary very clear. He was willing to discuss obligations, but the $500,000 demand was not something he would accept, simply because Marissa believed ending the relationship should come with a price. Marissa did not argue this time, although she also did not formally withdraw the amount, which left one last unresolved tension sitting between them. Edward had won nothing. Marissa had won nothing, and neither of them looked relieved. Because the strange thing about finally ending a relationship this complicated is that getting the answer you demanded for months does not necessarily feel like victory when that answer is goodbye. Edward started gathering the few things he planned to take with him immediately, while Marissa remained seated and watched him move through the room with a calmness that probably bothered her more than another argument would have. She asked whether he had somewhere to go, and Edward said he did. She asked whether he had already arranged it, and he admitted that he had thought ahead enough to make sure he would not need to remain there if the conversation ended the way he expected. That revelation hurt Marissa, because it proved the breakup had existed in Edward's mind before it existed out loud between them. She told him she wished he had given her some warning. And Edward reminded her that he had tried to explain his exhaustion many times, but neither of them understood how serious it had become until he finally stopped fighting. As Edward moved toward the door, Marissa told him that once he walked out, everything between them would change permanently, and Edward turned around because that sentence sounded almost like one final attempt to make him reconsider. He told her everything had already changed, and walking through the door was simply the first visible sign of something that had happened slowly over a long period. Marissa looked like she wanted to argue again, but this time she stopped herself. She asked whether he would answer her calls later, and Edward said they could communicate about necessary practical issues once both of them had time to cool down. But he did not want to restart emotional conversations every night, searching for a different ending. Marissa nodded, although she clearly hated the boundary, and Edward finally walked out without another dramatic confrontation. What makes the ending so uncomfortable is that neither Edward nor Marissa gets to leave with a simple explanation that makes everything easier. Marissa cannot honestly say Edward abandoned her without warning when he had been expressing insecurity for months. But Edward also cannot pretend Marissa contributed nothing or that every concern she raised was unreasonable. They both invested heavily, they both became afraid, and they both responded to that fear in ways that made the other person feel less secure. The $500,000 demand became the loudest moment of the breakup, but it was not really the beginning of the collapse. It was the moment that exposed how differently they measured sacrifice, fairness, loyalty, and responsibility after spending so long believing love would eventually force those definitions to match. Edward believed refusing the money was finally refusing a relationship dynamic where he always felt he had something else to prove, while Marissa believed asking for financial protection was a response to watching a future she had reorganized her life around suddenly disappear. The problem was that neither interpretation completely erased the other one, which is exactly why the situation remained so emotionally messy. If Edward had immediately paid whatever Marissa asked, he might have walked away feeling used and resentful. But if Marissa simply accepted the breakup without discussing legitimate shared consequences, she might have felt like she was being punished for taking the relationship seriously. The only reasonable path left was separating actual obligations from emotional pain, because once heartbreak becomes a number, the argument can continue long after the relationship itself is dead. The bigger question is whether Marissa's $500,000 demand was truly about money, or whether it was the last moment where she believed she still had some control over how the relationship ended. Edward had spent so much time searching for reassurance that Marissa became accustomed to being the person, deciding whether things were stable. And the second Edward stopped asking and started leaving, their entire balance changed. Suddenly, Marissa was the one demanding answers, asking whether there was someone else, offering another conversation tomorrow, and wondering whether one final change could make Edward stay. Edward, meanwhile, became the person saying that the relationship had already given him all the answers he needed. And that reversal may be more important than the money itself. Because $500,000 is the number everybody would remember, But the most damaging sentence was probably Edward telling Marissa that he no longer needed her to understand why he was leaving. That is the moment the relationship stopped being a debate, because Edward was no longer trying to win his case. He was simply making a decision. Marissa could disagree, challenge his reasoning, change the financial demand, apologize for the uncertainty, or promise to communicate differently. But none of those things guaranteed that Edward would return to the emotional position he had occupied months earlier. Sometimes a relationship reaches a point where the person demanding reassurance finally learns how to live without receiving it. And by the time the other partner recognizes that change, the opportunity to repair the original insecurity may already be gone.